So, Return of Them is a thing, or rather was a thing. Klei's update chain, as it's been dubbed, aimed to introduce a new area to the game full of new monsters, objects, items, and diverse biomes. My coverage of the updates has definitely had a few gaps, so I'll be going over each update briefly again in this video, and then giving my overall consensus on the series of updates. Time to contribute to the dilly-dally by stating that I'll cease dilly-dallying, and ultimately end up slowing down this intro segment and dragging out the pacing of this video. Turn of Tides was the first update in Return of Them. Comparatively, it didn't really add very much content-wise, but the point of it was to pave the way for all or most future updates in ROT by adding a completely new ocean area, replacing the iconic stage prop waves. It also added a then-barebones boating system, replete with steering wheels, anchors, sails, and some new sailing mechanics using these new items. At the time, the ocean was extremely empty, not containing much save for some rocks, which is definitely, absolutely, certainly, absolutely not still the case today. Aside from the ocean and the basic boating mechanics, the update also added a mysterious coastal formation that you could run into, the Lunar Island. This new location contained a small number of biomes which, much like the ocean, contained plenty of rocks, but also things other than rocks, such as some fancy tainted versions of existing mobs, the gory pangol, the stalwart crystal spiders, and the abhorrent horror hounds. The designs of these three creatures was pretty cool. It was definitely interesting to see some grim takes on some of our favourite Don't Starve denizens. Apart from all this, there's not that much to talk about content-wise regarding Turn of Tides, but it did add a really cool new area, and some interesting, although slightly controversial, mechanics. Things were looking up for the rest of Return of Them. It was only one update in, and although it was somewhat content light, that was generally excusable because of the significant changes made to the server's world. DST players, myself included, were most excited for what was to come. The next update in ROT was Salty Dog. A bit smaller than Turn of Tides, the first thing that this update added was the Brine Pool's biome, only really containing one collectible resource and one monster, which made it more of a set piece or mini biome. Salt can be mined from the rock formations extruding from the salty ocean brine, which can be used to craft one thing. The salt box, which can be used to store raw goods that are cookable and not deployable, such as seeds. A pretty nifty addition to your camp kitchen. However, you'd better watch out because the salty spires are guarded by the horrifying cookie cutters, eager to eat holes out of your delicious boat. And look, I know I've been a bit sardonic throughout this video so far, but I actually really like the design of cookie cutters. They're probably my favourite looking monster in the whole game that I can think of, which does sound a bit random because of how inconsequential they are, but still. I love the way they are a warped interpretation of a real life creature, sort of adapted to fit within the Don't Starve world. Also, I just love the name Cookie Cutter. It sounds like such an innocent name even though it describes what's really an unsettling creature. So far, Return of Them has been pretty much nailing the creature designs, which is really awesome. The other main thing added in the Salty Dog update was the Malbatross boss creature. It spawns with a chance after fishing in a deep water shoal, appearing and attacking the player. It's honestly a fairly interesting fight, but the issue lies within the fact that the boss has such a low chance to spawn. The fact that its drops are mostly just aids to help you sailing faster, unless you're spending a ton of time on the water, it's probably more time efficient to just not bother. So to reiterate, cool boss fight, but not much reason to actually fight it, because even if the chance for the thing to appear was just a little bit higher, my opinion on the Malbatross could be completely different, as it might not be such a potentially ridiculous time investment. Anyway, that's the bulk of what's going on with Salty Dog. The ocean is still pretty empty, let's be honest, but hey, it's only the second update. There's surely plenty of ocean-filling content to come. Update numero 3 is Hook, Line and Inker, which focused on adding a slew of new mechanics focused around fishing. Evidently, the Don't Starve devs were a bit worried that the game would be unlike literally every other survival sandbox game ever made, and felt that they just had to add some fishing mechanics. To be one of the cool kids, you know? I could go in-depth about the fishing mechanics in this video, but I won't, because it's supposed to be a video about Return of Them, not a video about fishing with a bit of Return of Them on the side. But in short, without dumping a Bible on you, you use bait and tackle to catch fish by playing a short minigame. Hooray. The update also added a couple of creatures to add a bit more life to the ocean, the skitter squids and the narwhales. Both of them just simply have a chance to randomly appear near the player. Skitter squids won't do much apart from be a nuisance, snapping up fish nearby you might be trying to catch. They have a chance to drop light bulbs upon death, which can be used to make a lantern if you are playing without caves, because you're A, either clinically insane, or B, playing the game on a potato battery. Narwhales can be tamed with meat and used as ocean companions, tossing items on the water towards the player and attacking monsters. If attacked instead, they will attempt to drill the player's boat with their horn, which will spring a small leak when destroyed. There isn't really much use in befriending them. They're generally better off dead because their horn can be used in crafting a boss drop. That's about all that was added in Hook, Line and Inker. If you really want to learn more about the fishing mechanics, I have an old video on the system that you can check out. Click the card to find out. Apart from fishing, the update only really added a couple of ambient mobs, seeing as it was mostly focused on said fishing system. Seems fair enough, so the ocean will become more populated in the future, right? Right? She sells she shells. Probably the update in this list that I'm the most conflicted about. You could call it the yin and yang of Return of Them. On one side, you've got the initially defensive, but ultimately soft-shelled and remorseful new NPC that you can befriend in order to retrieve some special items and interesting dialogue. And on the other side, you have, well, I'm sure the majority of you have seen this video, or have at least seen the thumbnail, so no explanation needed. Let's talk about the yin side first. Pearl is an NPC who you can find on her own little island that generates randomly in the ocean. She will initially be resentful towards the player, politely instructing them to piss off, but will become more transparent the more gifts you inject into her pie hole. Because if there's any way to make friends according to video games, it's to use them as a test subject for your abhorrent kitchen experiments. Pearl will give you access to a number of items, mostly designed to assist with the fishing mechanics introduced in the previous update, as well as shell bells which can be tuned and used to make some fat beats. In order to unlock all of her recipes, as well as the final reward, you must do quests for her, ranging from feeding her flour salad, repairing her house, and doing menial gardening work. In general, I quite like the addition of Pearl to DST. She's a bit of a breath of fresh air, to be honest, somehow managing to be more interesting of a character than most of the actual characters we've gotten recently. Part of me feels as though the purist in me should be raging about the fact that there is a fully fledged NPC in Don't Starve now, but to be honest, I think I'm so starved for a character right now whose entire personality isn't just some one-word catchphrase and nothing else to boot. Upon reaching max friendship with Pearl, she'll bestow upon you her namesake, Pearl, an item which holds significant emotional value. Not because it's important to Pearl or anything, but rather because it's the key to the emotionally scarring experience that is fighting the Crab King. Alright boys, cue the high-tempo death metal because we're going on a rant! Just kidding. Maybe, let's try something a bit more mellow. Crab King is the epitome of missed opportunities. For starters, I absolutely adore its visual design. And no, I'm not just saying that to dilute my upcoming argument so I don't sound like a negative Nancy. I mean it. There is a lot of symbolism surrounding the boss's design. For one, you can clearly see that his posture is impacted by the colossal crown on top of his head, as it weighs down upon him. Almost like the deal that he made with the moon may similarly weigh upon his conscience, as it is ultimately what drove him and Pearl apart. Some symbolism here that I cleverly stole from my Crab King thumbnail. Don't mind if I do. It's honestly a shame that the boss doesn't speak during the fight, perhaps to beg for forgiveness or imply that he's been taken over by his benefactors. I know the Crab King isn't exactly as final as the Feel Weaver, the only other boss in the game that speaks, but still, it might have been nice to hear some of the other side of the story. And the gameplay. Well, I needn't go over this to be honest, but in short, Crab King is a spammy bastard who requires an incredibly specific strategy to defeat, otherwise you are practically doomed. The basic concept is interesting though. Inserting gems to your liking to sort of control how the boss fight will pan out is a really cool idea, but it doesn't help that the gems' effects are either mostly forgettable, or, contrastingly, able to incur several Armageddon's worth upon everything you know and love. Even while in a group, fighting this boss is a genuine headache, which definitely says something considering the difficulty level of most other bosses in the game with multiple people. Troubled Waters is a wee bit more forgettable than the other updates, adding a relatively small amount of content to the ocean. It added a small number of craftables, namely some interesting new mast upgrades as well as a water pump, which is essentially a fuel-free ice flingomatic that can only be built on boats. The mast upgrades are an interesting idea. They add a little bit of extra functionality to masts, which saves some space on your vessel. One of them gives your boat protection from lightning strikes, the same as a lightning rod, and the other is essentially a campfire that doesn't set things on fire, nor can be cooked with. And while both of these are pretty neat, it also would have been nice to see a few more. As of this update, the oceans are now populated with ever so slightly more life. There are the omnipresent occult orchids known as seaweeds, appearing in clusters in random places around the ocean. Seaweeds can be killed and replanted on any sea stack, and shorn for a new food resource, barnacles, at night, or if you're playing as Wormwood, unless you have a death wish. Barnacles can be used to cook a few new dishes in the crockpot. As well as the barnacle recipes, this update also adds some new leafy meat dishes, which greatly increase the versatility of meaty bulbs, especially in the late game. Next was the Rockjaw, a menacing ocean threat dealing tons of AoE damage. It can appear anytime a shoal of fish appears, making exploring the ocean a little bit more threatening in general. Rockjaws sadly only drop some fish meat and rocks upon death, making them generally not worth the time spent killing them. Finally, this update also introduces two new shadow creatures, designed to give you a whole new league of trouble while boating on the ocean. The first, the Terror Claw, is the ocean equivalent of the Terror Beak, transforming into one when the player moves onto land and vice versa. It's quite simple to combat, approaching the player's boat and attacking them should they come near it, similar to shadow creatures that appear on land. The second creature introduced is a bit different to the others, not being killable, but rather being a bit more of a character than the faceless armadas of terrorbeaks and crawling horrors. Jones appears at the rim of your boat and will attempt to raise and lower anchors and sails present on your boat, surely causing chaos. Standing on its hands will cause him to avoid the player, and standing on the head will cause it to briefly vanish and then shortly reappear. After this happens for the third time, Wavy will despawn. If the player is below half sanity, Jonesy can also extinguish fires, and if below a quarter, it can remove boat patches holding your raft together, so watch out. The addition of these new shadow creatures, particularly the latter, can make the ocean a surprisingly dangerous place to be at low sanity, so be sure to pack plenty of dried seaweed. And that's all that was added in Troubled Waters. Mildly interesting, but also a bit superficial, bit of a common theme really. On to the next. Forgotten Knowledge. This is when things are starting to get interesting. This update added 2 new biomes, and enough content to fill both of them to the brim. New biomes in Don't Starve are always huge. There really aren't that many of them, and exploring the same ones over and over again definitely gets a bit boring. Notably, both of the new biomes are slightly deviant from Return of Them's dominant themes, as they're not actually part of the ocean like one might suspect. Instead, they both exist underground, in the caves, which is definitely a welcome change. If you thought the surface got a bit bland after a while, the caves is a whole nother story. Even post-Forgotten Knowledge, they are largely just nothing, the only notable area being the ruins, and of course the 2 new areas added in this update. The first of the new biomes is the Lunar Grotto, a spooky variant of the blue mushroom forest corrupted by lunar influence. I love the way this biome looks. Seriously, it never gets old. The use of objects on the ceiling is such a clever use of the game engine. The designs and colors are cohesive, everything is just brought together to make a super awesome area. This is how video game biomes should be. None of that empty, boring stuff the ocean is full of. I especially enjoyed the opportunity taken for environmental storytelling, something that's honestly quite rare in any Don't Starve games. The update's trailer reveals this new area is actually located underneath the lunar island, which does add that extra layer of intrigue and storytelling. Speaking of trailer, look, I do want to like this one, but the inconsistency of Maxwell's chin is just throwing me off here. I mean, originally, it looked like a shovel, right? But in this trailer, it looks more like a chisel? How long until we've cycled through an entire tool shed's worth of Maxwell chins? The next area added is the Ancient Archives, a really interesting fusion of lunar and ancient magics. Similar to how the grotto always generates connected to the blue mushroom forest, the archives will always be connected to the grotto via a tunnel of boulders and rocks. Once it's cleared, you will now have free access to the archives, although further exploration will be required to unlock its deepest secrets. Upon initially entering the area, everything will be deactivated. Once you obtain an iridescent gem by deconstructing a Mooncrawler's staff, it can be placed on a pillar located somewhere in the ruins alongside the other 2, which will activate many of the puzzles found around the biome, as well as some free lighting and automated defenses. If there's one thing this update does really well, it's the way that it hints to new players what to do in order to progress. This is something that Don't Starve is absolutely awful at in general. Please explain to me how a new player is supposed to figure out that to spawn Misery Toadstool, you need to first build a scarecrow, catch a canary using a bird trap, take it into the caves, wait for it to get poisoned, and then when it's about to die, drop it next to a toadstool cab and wait for it to explode. All of that, let alone defeat the thing. Anyway though, this update does actually hint towards how you're supposed to complete the new area. I was actually able to find all the new secrets in the archive area without checking the wiki or some other external source, which is honestly a bit of a first for Don't Starve. A 100% new player wouldn't have a very good time trying to figure out this biome secret though, due to the obscurity of finding an iridescent gem, but look, it's a start. A small qualm I had was also that the main puzzle you do in the archives, in order to unlock the 3 special blueprints, isn't really that much of a puzzle. As opposed to collecting hints in order to reach the outcome, you simply brute force it, hoping to get lucky with the combination or just relying on your memory. It's not terrible puzzle design, it's just a bit frustrating and not very interesting. When I first did it, I was listening up for an auditory cue or something like that and got confused. Like, you know that puzzle game, The Witness? Imagine if you had to beat that entire game, but none of the puzzle panels had any symbols on them, and you just had to sit there drawing random patterns until something worked. Overall, this update is easily one of my favorite additions from Return of Them. It adds some awesome new areas, is absolutely dripping with lore and secrets, and is generally just fun to explore and play. And look, hey, no more suffering without Dark Swords because you have to wait for tree guards to spawn. Thanks, Mush Gnomes. Reap What You Sow is easily the most random update in Return of Them, which means that it has virtually nothing to do with the rest of the update line. Whatsoever. The only connection it does have is continuing Forgotten's Knowledge theme of refurbishing some older content present in the game, except instead of simply adding some extra goodies to an old system, it completely and utterly revises the farming system, a system that was just so outdated, being more or less unchanged since the game originally released. Surprise, surprise, a literally 7-year-old system didn't really hold up well in the contemporary game, and so Reap What You Sow was certainly a welcome addition to DST. If you ask me, RWYS probably shouldn't have been branded as part of Return of Them, simply due to how disconnected it was from the rest of the updates. But according to Klei and the wiki, it is officially an ROT update, so I kind of have to include it in this video. Most things that I have to say about this update are already present in their own video, which you can view by clicking the card in the top right. But in short, great update, revolutionized food farming early game, removed several old and outdated systems present in the game, making it easily one of ROT's best. Now onto the final update brought by Return of Them. Eye of the Storm is the final update, meant to tie everything together and end the recent chapter of updates. Throughout the course of Return of Them, 3 altars were added to the game. The first one is simply built from 3 pieces found around the lunar island. The second is obtained by killing the Crab King with a pearl inserted, and the third is retrieved by digging it up with the Astral Detector, an item obtained from the archives which can then be used to locate all 3 altars. By assembling the 3 in a triangle, the mysterious energy will appear, which will begin a series of unique endgame events. The Moonstorms, a ravaging concentration of lunar energy racking the surface of the world and upsetting the regularity of the lunar calendar, changing nighttime into moon time, removing the need for light sources. I really like the way this event has 2 major changes on the world. It really feels like shit's about to go down. I definitely would have liked to see some more changes though, as the changed clock and moonstorms do get a bit uninteresting after a while. Perhaps some more mutated mobs that aren't just the birds. We already know the moon has some immense corrupting power when exposed to certain creatures, case in point the lunar island, so I don't think this is all that unreasonable. Upon entering the moonstorms, we can see what looks like a familiar face. My god. It's him. Wagstaff is back. I called it. I fucking called it! The enigmatic Wagstaff is now present in DSC as an NPC, instead of a player character, and while I absolutely adore the narrative implications of him being here, acting as some sort of puppet master controlling the survivors now that he's risen to power, the actual implementation, and the way that this is revealed in-game is, well, we can just say that Don't Starve has done better. And yes, I know that it might be a bit unfair to compare NPC Wagstaff to Maxwell, one of the most effectively written video game characters that I can think of, but it will be impossible not to draw comparisons. This is the first time we've ever had an NPC appear in-game like this since Solo Don't Starve, so I think it's fair to expect some interesting dialogue here. Strangely, going back, Maxwell didn't really have all that much to say. He had a total of 2 lines in sandbox mode, as the vast majority were all contained within adventure, but even then there weren't that many. But despite the lack of volume, each and every one of them is so incredibly iconic. And no, to be clear, with this update I wasn't expecting for there to be a new "Say pal, you don't look so good" kind of line, but come on. I'll be needing some assistance shortly. It's just not the same. It's also not like Wagstaff himself is an inherently boring character is hard to write good lines for. Seriously, just take a look at his lines from Hamlet or the base game. There are some fantastic ones in there. Furthermore, I strongly dislike the fact that Wagstaff still uses the normal character model when he appears in game. Height has always been used to symbolize power in the Don't Starve style. The fact that every character you play as looks like some sort of weird bobblehead thing walking around is no accident. That initial scene where we see Wilson literally lying on the ground at a low point next to the almost comically tall Maxwell who towers over him initially sets up this symbolism. Maxwell said his snarky line towards the player, which told them what their goals should be, but ultimately provided no direct help, making it quite apparent that he was the villain of this story. These metaphors are continued throughout adventure mode. As Wilson progresses through the 5 worlds, Maxwell becomes increasingly more distorted, twisted and shorter as Wilson comes closer and closer to his position. Until then, finally, Maxwell literally becomes a playable character. The Wagstaff storyline is sort of the opposite of this. Instead of being usurped by someone seeking out the throne, Wagstaff is the usurper. He is clearly not one of the survivors anymore, hence why he's commanding them, but he still appears as one of them for some reason. And furthering this, I think a tiny baby Wagstaff just looks too friendly, despite the fact that it's unlikely he's working with you as opposed to simply manipulating you. If he were to tower over the player Maxwell style, it would send a much clearer message to any players who, you know, aren't well versed in obscure Don't Starve lore. Anyway, storytelling stuff aside, the actual lunar event itself I'm mostly apathetic towards. You assist baby Wagstaff in containing part of the lunar static, which will be used for the next part of the quest, by defending him against a series of mutated birds that attack the container. Every now and then, Wagstaff will ask you to hand one of his poorly named tools in order to continue the event. Playing solo, this event was mostly just frustrating, as I was basically unable to kill the birds in time to stop them from messing with Wagstaff's stuff, although switching to Wendy made things 1,000 times easier, surprise surprise. After you do the wave defense a total of 3 times, netting you 3 restrained static, you can use these in combination with some other ingredients found during the Moonstorm in order to build Wagstaff's latest invention over the mysterious energy, and then upgrade it in a group project fashion similar to the Celestial Portal. This was probably my least favourite phase of this whole event, because the 2 special ingredients that you must obtain, A, infused moonglass being mined from nodes that randomly appear in the storm, and B, moon gleams being caught with a bug net, spoil extremely quickly, like ludicrously so. This means that in order to transport them to the lunar island, you pretty much need to defeat the Bee Queen in order to obtain bundle wraps to keep them fresh. I strongly dislike this fact, because now we are required to defeat not only 1, but 2 entire raid bosses just so we can face a 3rd. It doesn't really serve much purpose aside from squeezing some extra playtime out of every player, or at least that's how it felt to me. You could of course switch the server event to Winter's Feast and craft gift wrap instead for a much cheaper cost, which saves you from having to defeat one of the game's most difficult bosses. This is what I did, and honestly, I would not blame you for doing the same, especially if you're playing solo, as the Bee Queen is easily one of the, if not the worst boss in the game to defeat solo. Speaking of raid bosses, once you assemble all 3 stages of Wagstaff's Lunar Siphonator, a meteor storm will occur occur, and the brand new boss that lies at the end of the Lunar questline will finally appear, the Celestial Champion. CC is a boss that I'm somewhat apathetic about. No, apathy isn't the only emotion that I'm capable of. Probably. The boss fight is fairly interesting. I do like the fact that it has 3 phases, each loosely inspired by one of the 3 altars. The boss also feels a lot fairer than some of the other endgame boss fights in DST, namely Fuel Weaver with its stupid amount of healing, invincibility, and ability to control the player's movement. The champion has no gimmicks of the sort, simply attacking the player, each phase increasing in complexity, and apparently inspired by a random noughties fad, with different ways to crush the player into a fine grey paste. In phase 1, the champion embodies the first fad, Bakugan, and to be honest, it wouldn't surprise me if no one else remembers this thing. In essence, it rolls around like a big stupid ball, dealing a lot of damage and generally being hard to hit, but having sizable downtime in between each roll. It can also deal AoE damage repeatedly and summon a swarm of Gestalt to attack the player. Phase 1 has 10,000 HP, which is honestly quite a manageable amount, even solo. In Phase 2, Bakugan has died out, and now Beyblades take its place. Probably the only early 2000s fad that wasn't utter garbage, only being partially made of cheap plastic. In this phase, the Celestial Champion will let it rip by spinning aggressively towards the player, dealing 100 damage per hit, an absolutely terrifying number even towards well-prepared players, so be sure to stay light on your feet. When the champion starts his attack, it will replicate the speed of its target, so be sure to equip your speed boosting equipment after it begins. In a similar fashion to the first phase, it'll summon swarms of greater Gestalts, and can perform a simple melee attack should you come too close. Something that I do like about the champion is that although it can heal itself when off-screen, it's unable to revert itself back to a previous phase, which makes it a lot more manageable as you can pretty much take it on at your own pace, resulting in it being quite a forgiving boss, considering the amount of preemptive tasks you must complete in order to face it. Phase 3, much like the early 21st century fad of... look, I'm sure there was something that floated around and shot lasers everywhere. 2000s were a long time ago, man. In this phase, the boss will start floating and cease attacking you in hand-to-hand combat, instead shooting you from afar with a variety of almost bullet hell-like patterns. And while confusing at first, once you become familiar with the patterns, this phase can be much simpler to deal with. Additionally, the champion can perform a hyped-up version of the similar attacks from the first and second phases, summoning greater and regular Gestalts constantly until the 30 seconds have passed, or the player runs away or gets put to sleep. While fighting this phase, don't forget that you can always retreat and come back if you're a bit under the weather from the first and second phases. The item that the champion drops is also really cool. Portable Infinite Light is massive, and the DPS boost is pretty awesome too. It is a shame that the boss only has 2 drops however, unlike Fuel Weaver who has 3. It would definitely have been neat to see a lunar themed body slot item in order to make a complete armor set. Design wise, I'm somewhat indifferent towards the Celestial Champion's design. I was certainly never a fan of the Fuel Weaver spam me bullshit and cheap gimmicks, but if there was one thing that I did like about it a lot, it was the aesthetics. Fighting this bad boy felt super climactic, like shit was going down. Simply put, I don't get that feeling from CC pretty much whatsoever. Fuel Weaver is intimidation incarnate, skulking around its arena, clearly some machination of a greater power. Not only that, but it talks, spouting somewhat decipherable exposition which, despite its crypticness, really added to the feeling of the ultimate showdown that was about to take place. The champion, on the other hand, is... well, it's a ball. It's a big, stupid ball that doesn't talk. While I do really like the 3 phases thing, and how each phase is based off of a particular altar, it feels like a bit of a predictable design, and not really like a final boss. Nowhere near the level of Bone Zone Ultimatum brought by the Fuel Weaver. So, that's the end of that. Every Return of Them update covered in a single video, and kudos to you if you're still here watching, this thing was definitely a bit longer than usual. It's not the end of updates centering around the new ocean area, and as I write this video script, the game already has another ocean-themed update in open beta, which does make the designation of updates under this umbrella a little bit arbitrary, but whatever. What's important is that it's over, and I think when reviewing an update chain like this, it's important to remember that all this new content is free. I didn't waste any money in order to play it, and although I definitely spent a lot of time playing it, in the end I did enjoy doing so. Well, mostly. You've probably noticed that throughout this video I refrain from giving number ratings, or ratings of any sort for that matter, and that's because, well, A, it's virtually impossible to sum up the many facets of a thing into a singular defining number, and B, it's also quite difficult to stay consistent with them. Not only that, but usually my thoughts on a game update will change after I put them out in a video. Who am I kidding? Often. No, they always do. Oftentimes as soon as the video is out, so it's basically guaranteed that things that I've said in this video will be outdated, perhaps even right now as you're watching it. All of this to say that Return of Them was pretty good overall. Throughout the updates there was definitely just a lot of missed potential, and man, the ocean is just still so empty. It certainly felt very odd to have the update chain technically be finished, but still with plenty of clearly missing and half-assed content still existing within the new areas. But all in all, ROT is worthwhile. There's still a lot of fun to be had, especially so if you're a masochist, and, you know, that being said, there's clearly a lot of content yet to be introduced into the ocean, so things are definitely looking up from here. And that's all I have to say. really. Quite frankly, I don't have the willpower to write some grandiose outro to this video, so apathy is what you get instead. Man, I really gotta work on that, huh? So that just about does it for this one. As per usual, please leave your thoughts on this video in the comments. Well, if you feel like it. It's definitely a big ask to request an entire essay on basically a year and a half's worth of content, so your call. In addition, a giga massive thanks to Lumpkin for editing this entire video. It was quite a huge task, so please go and check out his YouTube content. There are links in the pinned comment. He absolutely deserves it. Total legend. Anyway, that's the end of that. Guess I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta.